Good afternoon, everyone. We will begin in another 5 minutes. A very good afternoon to all present for this online lecture series on gender, human rights and law. I am Shaila D'Souza, Professor of Women Studies and the Dean of the Manohar Parrikar School of Law, Governance and Public Policy. Before we formally welcome and introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Urvashi Bhutalia, let me briefly talk a little bit about the Manohar Parrikar School of Law, Governance and Public Policy at Goa University that I am proud to represent. This school will house the disciplines of law, women's studies, public administration, tribal studies, disability studies, and a center for the study of social exclusion and inclusive policy. The vision of the Manohar Parrikar School is to serve as a knowledge hub where public policy experts, practitioners, and members of the wider public get a chance to deliberate on ideas of good governance and generate action-oriented research which would be in the larger interest of the state of Goa, the region, and the rest of India. In keeping with this vision, the Manohar Parrikar School of Law, Governance and Public Policy, together with the VM Salgaonkar College of Law, have organized this lecture series. Yesterday, we had an amazing participation with over 120 participants engaged in an enthralling lecture by Advocate Sanobar Keshwar. Today, we welcome the participation of students, teachers, and other public policy professionals to this collaborative lecture series and extend a warm welcome to our renowned speaker for today, Ma'am Urvashi Butalia. Ma'am, it is indeed an honor for us to have you speak to us today. I know how busy a schedule you keep, so we're very heartened that you have made time to speak to us today. And I invite our student of Women's Studies, Ms. Dia Parekh, to kindly introduce Madam Urvashi Butalia to the audience. Over to you, Dia.
Hello everyone, good afternoon. I would like to welcome Ma'am Urvashi Butalia. She is a prolific writer, publisher, feminist and historian. She has done her MA in Literature from Delhi University and a Master's in South Asian Studies from the University of London. Madam Urvashi Butalia began her career with Oxford University Press in Delhi and then worked with the London-based Z Books as an editor in 1982. When she returned back to India, she set up the first feminist publishing house in India known as the Kali for Women, along with Ritu Menon.
Dia, we can't hear you.
Ma'am, am I audible now?
Yes, yes. We missed you for a brief bit.
I'll just continue from where I left off.
Yes.
Urvashi ma'am has written on history of India, the partition, gender, communalism, fundamentalism, and media, and her writings have appeared in several newspapers and magazines, including The Guardian, New Internationalist, The Statesman, Times of India, and many more. We cannot go without talking about her award-winning book, The Other Side of Silence, Voices from the Partition of India, which we've also learned in our course and is an amazing, amazing book. There are many other books that we come across when we talk about her writings, such as, in other words, New Writing by Indian Women, Making a Difference, Feminist Publishing in the South, Women and Right-Wing Movements, Mona, The Indian Reader, and a lot more. Ma'am Butalia has been active in the Indian and global women's movement, and she has worked with SAMTA, an organization responsible for bringing about the change in India's laws on violence against women, dowry, and rape. She's a consultant for several national and international organizations, including Oxfam India. She's taught in University of Delhi, Ashoka University, and many more, and it is our pleasure to have you speak to us today at the Goa University, ma'am. We're sure that the students of law and women's studies will be enriched by your lecture today. A very warm welcome from all of us to you.
Thank you so much, Dia and Shella. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes, we can, Urvashi. Go ahead.
And thank you also to the Manohar Parrikar School of Law, Public Governance and Public Policy and the B.M. Salgaonkar Institute. I'm delighted to be here to talk to all of you. You know, when Dia was introducing me, I was thinking it's so strange to listen to you yourself being introduced by somebody, because I was listening to it and thinking that I'm like a Jill of all trades, if one can call it that, being mainly a publisher, but occasionally a bit of a writer, occasionally a bit of a historian, not really an academic, most of my life an activist, so lots of chota-mota things. And I was, when you get asked to do a session like this, and when you are given full freedom to talk about what you like, it's very difficult to know what to do. So I've been struggling, thinking, what can I talk about that can have any meaning? And then yesterday I discussed this with Shella, and she told me that most of you are students of women's studies and law. So I thought that what I would try to do is to somehow try and link the two. So what I'm going to do with you is not really an academic talk. I'm sorry, I don't know how to talk with jargon and all of that kind of stuff. I'm going to tell you a little bit about a sort of personal story of my own involvement in the women's movement in India and how women of my generation came to feminism and the women's movement. And I'm not going to get into debating the meanings of those two words or even the adequacy of those concepts to what we are talking about. And hope we can, if you have doubts about those or questions, we can talk in the discussion session subsequently. But I thought that what I might do is trace a sort of personal trajectory in the women's movement and to tease out from there some thoughts on the ideas that lie at the back of the courses that you're studying. As I said, it will not be an academic presentation and it will not be directly about law because I'm not a lawyer, I don't know much about it. Instead, I'll try to trace through my own involvement in the movement some trajectories of women's engagements with the law and the questions that those have raised for us. So let me begin with a brief history, which many of you may be familiar with, but just in case you're not. So women of my generation became involved with feminism and the women's movement or women's movements, depending on how we understand these things, in and around the 1970s. We're often asked, how did we come to this? What was it about that moment that drew us into what became the women's movement? So I think that there wasn't one path. There were many different paths that led each of us individually and those of us who worked with organizations collectively into this involvement. First of all, there was something about that moment in time that led women from different parts of the country to be involved in various forms of activism that had to do with their identities as women. The India in which people like me grew up was a country still filled with some of the idealisms and dreams of the post-independence years, but it was also a country where across the board, people were beginning to become very dissatisfied at the unmet promises of independence and were beginning to raise their voices about those. Not that it hadn't happened before, because if you look beyond the narrative, the euphoric narrative of the nationalist movement and the moment of independence, you see that even in the 40s and 50s, there are movements on the ground in India which are actually questioning the kind of independence that is being fought for and the kinds of issues that our leaders at the time are talking about. But post-independence, you start to see a lot happening around the 60s and the 70s particularly. There are many protest movements across India which involve men and women. They involve young students and older people. They cut across rural and urban divides. They have people of different castes and classes and tribes. I won't go into detail into any of these, but there were, for example, huge protests of peasants and tribals in Maharashtra in the 60s. And one of the leaders of the Warli revolt was a woman called Godavari Parulekar. And in any one of these movements, you find a lot of women who are also taking the lead. There was the anti-price rise movement also in Maharashtra, which was actually totally a women's movement where women in their thousands, some 25,000 at a time, came together to protest about rising prices. And they gave a particularly female, if you can say that, character to that protest by bringing out of their houses all the kitchen implements and walking down the streets, banging those implements, like the metal tin in which you got atta, or like the belan with which you make rotis, or like the patila in which you cook, and so on and so forth. So there was that. There was the Chipko movement in Garhwal, which was a women's movement, but not necessarily a feminist one, very different from what was going on in Maharashtra, but mobilizing large numbers of women. There was the Naxalite movement in Bengal. There was a very interesting movement led by Jaiprakash Narayan in Bihar, in a place called Bodh Gaya, which was a movement in which students came together, women and men, to redistribute land because large tracts of land were held by people, very rich zamindars and others. And one of the promises of independence that there would be land distribution had not actually been met. Then in Maharashtra, again, there was the Namantar movement for the renaming of Marathwada University, which was a Dalit movement, again with the involvement of lots and lots of women. So across the board, you find a mobilization of women in many, many different parts of the country. They're not necessarily connected to each other, these movements, but they're not unconnected either. And what over time starts to happen is that inside many of these movements, women start to raise many questions. For example, questions to do with why power is always held by men, why, for example, in trade unions, the leadership is always male, and women workers are not considered at all. They're always relegated to the roles of being housewives and cooks and mothers and wives. And they begin asking questions about violence against women and why this was seen as something normal. I use it within quotes. They begin raising questions in other ways. So in Ahmedabad, for example, it is in the 70s that groups of women who are head loaders working in fabric textile factories in the city, which was a big industry of the city at that time, go and seek out Ila Bhatt, the woman who founded SEVA and who Self-Employed Women's Association, and who was at that time in charge or one of the members of an organization called the Textile Labor Association. And her job was to help the wives of the male workers to get a sense of involvement. But here were women workers, women, informal workers, going to her and saying, come and take a look at the conditions under which we live. And she goes to see them, and that is what leads to her exit from the Textile Labor Association and the founding of what becomes one of the largest women's union type associations in the world, the Self-Employed Women's Association. This happens in 1972. So many women were being mobilized, and several exited from larger organizations, which they felt were patriarchal and had no space for them, and formed their own groups. These came to be called autonomous groups, which were not affiliated to any party, any political party. And even political parties, you get to see that around the same time. You see different political parties building up women's sections and setting up their own large groups. So all sorts of approaches to feminist or women's politics are visible at this time. If communist women brought one kind of approach, women like Ila Bhatt brought a more Gandhian model of so-called feminism, and Ambedkarite or Dalit women represented yet another form of activism. You get all of this happening. So for different women in different parts of the country, they're coming into a kind of feminist politics. And I know I've not explained what I mean by this, but as I said, we can talk about it at the end. Was different depending on the social, political, and economic context around them. In Delhi at university, so we were at university in the early 70s, we were also impacted by what one can call this wave that was spreading across the country. Politics was very much in the air. We discussed things all the time. We fought for change. We held protests and marches, and this continued after we left university. And we started to create women's groups that began to engage in campaigns. Our battles were very simple at the time. In the university, we fought for things like special buses for women students because it was very difficult to travel in buses with men, a ban on things like beauty contests or fewer restrictions on women hostelers and so on. But there were battles. They made us feel involved, that we were engaged in something larger than us. It may seem funny to people now. These might seem like very small things, but that time we felt very connected and we felt we were fighting for crucial change. Once we left university behind, the arenas shifted. So being at the university had helped us to connect with other students across the country, although it was not that easy because at that time there was no internet, there were hardly any telephones, and making contact was not that easy. But still, we got news, we read, we talked, and we got to know of things. I'm not saying this was happening across the country, everywhere, but it was certainly happening for us. Once out of university, the issues became different and bigger in some ways. This is when, for many of us, the engagements with law began. This is also when we began to realize gradually that while we could feel and sense injustice, the functioning of patriarchy, we actually had very little knowledge about the issues that we were confronted with. We had no real knowledge of even the histories of the issues we were involved in. Well, let me give you an example of this. Around the late 70s and 80s, women's groups across the country became involved in nationwide campaigns against rape and campaigns against dowry. You've probably read, it's by now very well known, the history of the involvement and the way the anti-rape battles became a national issue, starting with the Mathura rape case and the letter that 4 lawyers wrote, the open letter to the Chief Justice of India, objecting to the acquittal of the policeman in that case as a travesty of justice. So I'm not going to go into that, but that history is quite well known. But I wanted to talk about another subject which is less known. So we became involved a lot in the campaigns against dowry. And when I say campaigns against dowry, I'm talking of a particular phenomenon that became apparent to us in, especially feminists in Delhi. It started with Delhi, because somehow being involved in the women's movement and talking about issues among ourselves, and the talking and the dialogues and the conversation were a very important part of our growing consciousness. So talking about these things also alerted us to what was happening around us, and we noticed more things than we had done previously. And one of the things we noticed was the ways in which many young women were dying inside their houses. And they were said to have died because a particular kind of stove, cooking stove that was used at that time, had burst. And those cooking stoves made of in which kerosene oil was used, and there were stoves which had kerosene oil in a little container at the bottom and wicks coming out of it, and you pumped the oil up the wicks and then you lit it. So there was a possibility that those stoves, if pumped over much or if not enough oil and you pumped in air, could burst. So earlier we had not really noticed this, but when we began to notice, we began to ask questions like, for example, when the stove burst, why was it that it was always a young newly married woman who was killed? After all, there may have been more women working in the kitchen. And why was it that other women who were with her were not harmed by it, and so on? So this led us to start a campaign against dowry. And yet, when we started, we knew zero. We knew little about the origins or the history of dowry. We all, in many families, dowry had been practiced, but it had stopped or it was going on. But nobody had ever questioned it. We didn't know where it came from. Was it only a Hindu custom? Was it only urban? Was it only middle class? So on. And how, if it was like a gift to the woman when she was married, because she didn't get any property, how did it turn into a form of violence and assault and murder towards women? We had no information, no books, no knowledge that could help us to understand these issues because, of course, academic disciplines, existing disciplines, had basically taken the man as the norm and had not bothered to study or look at women. So this also raised other questions. If we were to look at women, how would we do that? Women were absent in all disciplines, and the methodologies adopted by different disciplines did not allow anyone other than men to enter the picture. Once again, let me give you an example. A sociologist goes into a village to study X or Y thing. They would talk only to men and then would produce a piece of work that was believed to be the whole truth about that particular story. Even something as major as the census of India, the exercise that takes place every 10 years and is the largest numerical exercise in the world. So even in the census only began asking different questions that could draw different truths about women very late in its life. It wasn't until the 1991 census when, under pressure from women's groups, the enumerators, usually school teachers who went into homes to speak to people and collect information, began to talk about women's work. And they did this because the normal question that they always put was the question put to the man. And they would go into a house and ask the man, what do you do? And he would say, I'm a farmer, I'm this, I'm that. And then they would ask him, what does your wife do? And his answer would be nothing. And so they would record it as nothing. Under pressure from women's groups, the census enumerators now began asking questions of women and asking different questions. For example, they did not go in and ask women, what do you do? Because most women, being taught to undervalue their work, would probably also have said nothing. Instead, they asked, describe your day from morning to night. And with that, they got a picture of what women's work was like. So this was a micro step towards recognizing women as part of the human resources of our country. Of course, we need millions of micro steps like this. But the reason I'm telling you this story is that once it became possible for us to see, and I use the word within quotes, women, the nature of research and the nature of knowledge that we could glean started to become different. A little before the time I'm talking about, a new discipline had made its appearance on the world stage. It was called women's studies. It had been discussed at the international level. The discussions grew out of a felt need to find a way to study women that traditional disciplines did not offer. Something that also recognized that the study of women had to enter uncharted terrain, that of the personal, that of the home, that of the household, and that it had to cross the borders of the private and the public. At the time, there was a lot of discussion on what this discipline should be. Should it be fully fledged discipline, or should it be a critical perspective located within other mainstream disciplines? There wasn't much clarity, and this is why it began as a research and not a teaching discipline. Today, of course, it has become a fully fledged teaching discipline plus research. And if I'm not mistaken, there are roughly some 200 women's studies centers in India. My information is a little bit old, there may be a few more. Since your center is a center for law, governance, and policy, and Shaila told me that some of you are law students, I'd like now to speak a little bit about the law. When did we as feminists start engaging with the law, and why? I'm not sure I have a good answer to this question, but I will try to address it. Our early campaigns were focused on violence, especially on rape. So there were cases at the time like the case of Mathura, of Ramiza B, of a woman called Maya Tyagi, of rape in the Santhal Parganas, later of a woman called Suman Rani. Like many of the cases today, these became like emblematic and pushed the women's movement every time a step forward. So rape and dowry, we had seen many dowry deaths, and women's groups responded to these issues in a variety of ways. We did street plays, we talked with each other to understand, we held many conversations, we tried to do what we call consciousness raising, and we looked at the law, probably examining it for the first time in our lives. This is not to say that women had not engaged with the law previously. In fact, their engagement goes back many, many years. I'm sure that many of you are familiar with the Rahmabai's case from the 19th century. Later in the 20th century, women like Muthulakshmi Reddy and others worked on Devadasi law reform. Other women trained to become lawyers. Subsequent to that, there were many legal cases that brought up issues of women's citizenship rights, particularly at partition, when the law was used to recover women against their rights and transport them to places that the state had decided was their home. So in the 70s and 80s, many women began to see the law as a major arena for change. And so women worked to change laws. Both the anti-rape and anti-dowry movements were focused on changing the law, and later also the movement against sati or widow immolation. Or at least one might say that one of the focuses, if one can speak of focuses, of the movement was on changing the law. It wasn't the only one. Our demands were met in a way that was surprising to us. The state responded by asking the Law Commission to look into changes. The Law Commission spoke to women's groups across the board and then made recommendation, and the laws were changed. Now, as many of you know, the rape law or the sections in the IPC and the Evidence Act, etc., that deal with the rape law were changed for the first time in 1983. Initially, we felt a real sense of achievement at having managed to change the law. Of course, we had nothing to do with the actual drafting. And when we saw what our efforts had yielded in terms of the final letter of the law, this was for many of us the first time that we realized the gap between what you fight for and what you actually get is often very large. This was a sobering realization, although it did not curtail the focus on law. But yes, what it did do was to raise a fierce debate within the movement on the efficacy or otherwise of the law. With hindsight, we also realize that laws, like everything else, need to be revised and updated because the reality around us changes all the time. And again, let me give you an example of this. In the first change in the rape law that we got in 1983, we had asked that the name of the victim of sexual assault be kept secret because of the stigma associated with rape. But we did not realize that for many women, this meant living with the silence of what had been done to them, and therefore being made to feel all the more of a victim, and all the more of the term that is often used to describe women who've lived through sexual violence, a zinda lash, a terrible term. In fact, we later began to understand how this idea, which came out of some concern for the survivor, sometimes ended up isolating her and making her feel even more alone. And also, while the court proceedings and the media may have had to keep her identity a secret, within the community where she lived, it was often the case that people got to know. And then there were cases, as in the rape in 2012 of Jyoti Singh Pandey, when in order to hide the identity of the victim, a name was given to her, Nirbhaya, which was so inappropriate. Because obviously she was not fearless. She must have felt the fear. Everybody would feel fear. And if you recall, her mother kept saying that she wanted her daughter's name to be known. It was a very strange thing. I recall recently talking to a rape survivor, and she said to me, I was asking her if she wanted to be interviewed or if she wanted to keep her name secret. And she said, I want to be interviewed. I want to talk about it. I'm sick of hiding what happened to me. He's the one who did it, and I'm the one who's having to hide. He's not hiding. So in today's context, what we fought for 40 years ago may have been appropriate at that time. But clearly, we have to see the law not as a fixed thing, but as something that needs to evolve in tandem with the times and changes on the ground. And some things that you ask for at a certain time may not be appropriate at another time. Also, I think we didn't fully understand the need for not only a change in the letter of the law, but the structures that make it possible for the law to operate, that is the arms of the state. So what can we do with the police force who are basically criminals in uniform and are supported by the state? How can we expect them to respect women? What can we do with the judiciary who are so deeply misogynist that even today, in 2021, you have a chief justice who asks a rapist if he will marry the rape victim, or a chief minister who complains about women wearing jeans when he knows that he's completely in violation of the Constitution and of law when he does that, and who complains about her knees showing out of her jeans when all his life he has worn those dreadful khaki shorts which showed not only his knees, but also the length of his leg, and I don't know what else more. So, what can we do in that kind of atmosphere? So I think that in the early days in our dealings with the law, we assume what the law wants us to assume, that the law is neutral. It did not take us long to find out that there was no neutrality in the law. And even if the letter of the law itself tried to make itself sound neutral, the law could not be separated from either the lawmakers or those who are charged with enforcing it, or indeed those who are charged with carrying out what the law expects them to do. This led to other piecemeal measures, police training of judges, etc. But many of you are going to be lawyers. Who will train the lawyers? And lawyers go on to become judges. So who will train the judges? How much of your training, for example, the textbooks you use, address gender as central to the process of law? In the women's movement over the years and after considerable engagement with the law, further questions began to be raised. Was legal reform, which was much talked about, a real path to change, or was it another excuse for retaining the status quo? Many within women's groups felt that legal reform should be replaced with grassroots activism, and others were skeptical about whether legal reform in itself could have any impact on the lives of women on the ground. So we've had many engagements with the law. I don't have the time to go into any detail about them. I'll speak of perhaps just one or two others to illustrate some of the other points I want to make. I want to mention here 3 legal cases. One of a woman called Rupandeol Bajaj, a high-ranking IAS officer who was slapped on her bottom by a senior police officer at an official government dinner in 1988, and who, against everyone's advice, took this senior police officer to court and fought for 17 years and won. Roughly at the same time as this happened to her, there was another case of a woman whose name we do not know. In court records, she is just called Miss X, who filed a case against a senior manager in the firm she worked with, the Apparel Export Promotion Council of India, and who also won in the end. And then the third case of a Dalit woman called Bhavari Devi, who was gang raped by upper caste men in her village as retribution for basically doing her job, which was to try and prevent child marriage in the village. Bhavari's case, as many of you will probably know, is what eventually led to the filing of the Vishakha petition, which resulted many years later in the POSH Act. So given the gap between the time the Vishakha petition and the Vishakha guidelines were issued by the Supreme Court, which I think was in 1997, if I'm not mistaken, and the POSH Act, a huge amount of time had elapsed. So you can see how serious the state was about what is clearly a very major problem. Now, we may argue with the POSH Act and some of its provisions, and there's no doubt that it is an important step in the direction of making workplaces safe or starting to make them safe for women. But just having it in place is not enough. By the time it was enacted, the idea of workplaces had changed radically. So, for example, how does the Act deal with women working on their laptops in cafes or working from home? And also, by the time it was enacted, there had been so much change in society and the articulation of strong concerns of Dalits, queer and trans people. None of these find an expression in the Act. And this was pointed out again and again during the Me Too campaign. So the question that remains unanswered is, when the state changes laws, theoretically bringing in positive change, is the state doing that out of a sense of obligation and therefore just making the right moves which are actually meaningless? Is there anything in the changes we see in laws recently that speaks of that crucial thing, a political will and commitment to even something as basic as the equality of genders? Sadly, I think the answer has to be a no. A friend of mine who was in Parliament on the days when the more recent changes in the rape law was being discussed told me how every member of Parliament that day in the House was supremely uninterested and most were on their phones when things were being discussed. So what kind of commitment is that really? Also, if you read certain provisions of the Act, one of the really interesting things about it is how in the language that it uses, it does not even bother to change the masculine pronoun to the feminine one. So women are referred to in many sections of the POSH Act as he. If even this can't be done, then what is it that we are looking at? So clearly language is another battle that we have to fight. In Mrs. Bajaj's case, she won her case after 17 years. But what did that victory mean? It was in many ways a moral victory, but also for her a hollow victory. Although for the women's movement, it meant that there was now precedent of sorts to draw on. When Rupandeol Bajaj filed her case, there was no POSH Act. Indeed, there was no law on sexual harassment as such, so she had to file under other piecemeal clauses, one of which was called outraging the modesty of a woman. So even though she was fighting for justice, the law under which she was forced to fight was in itself so unjust that it reduced her to someone merely whose modesty had been outraged. Those 17 years took up her entire life. She lost her job, she lost many friends. And in the end, when she did win, the perpetrator was given a 6-month sentence, which he did not serve, and a fine of 200,000 rupees to be paid to an NGO. No one knows if he paid it. Bhamari lost her case at the Sessions Court. It took years for it to get to that stage, years, and then she lost it. In the meanwhile, she and her husband lost their livelihood because the whole village ostracized them. Her son turned against her for having reported the rape. The village did too. The question that I want to raise here is the law is intimately connected with the notion of justice. But what does justice mean for women? And what kind of justice is it that takes 17 years to arrive and then punishes a man for 6 months and lets him get away with not even serving that minimal sentence? I spoke earlier of the first set of changes in the rape law in 1983. One of the changes was to do with custodial rape, that if a woman who is been held in custody, say by the police or something, if she alleged rape, and if medical evidence showed that there had been rape, which is also another question, but we won't go into that, the accused would be presumed to be guilty until he could prove himself innocent. This was a radical provision, upturning the principle of law on its head, where you are assumed to be innocent till you're proved guilty. And it was not something that all women's groups supported. There was big battles among us about this. But the lawmakers claimed great credibility for themselves, claiming to be righting a historical wrong. And yet, in the first test case of this law, the Suman Rani case, which I think was, the verdict was in 1990 January, if I'm not mistaken, the court did not award the minimum mandatory sentence to the 2 accused policemen because it said they were young men and the only earning members of their families. No one thought to ask about the women. So within the movement over time, engagements with the law have led to a great deal of thinking on ideas of justice, and also on whether the law was the only means of providing justice, and what, if anything, did justice mean if it was so delayed. It also led to thinking on whether the state has an obligation to support victims of such crimes. Can justice be restorative and not merely retributive? It was women's movements who brought these questions about justice to the fore, and these are questions that continue to be debated today. After 2002 in Gujarat, when the question of mass sexual assaults during political strife came into public view, it was women's groups who fought for an expanded definition of rape in the law, something they achieved post the Jyoti Singh Pandey case. I'm going to try now to bring my presentation to a close. I've been talking for 40 minutes, and there are just a few other points I want to make, so I'll try and wrap it up quickly. There are many other instances I can cite of different kinds of engagements. One of the big discussions in the movement was on the question of enacting a uniform civil code. And there were within the movement differences on whether or not a UCC was desirable or possible in an atmosphere where identities were getting increasingly polarized on issues of religion, and where women were finding themselves caught between community and constitution, as in the Shahabano case, and later in the Hadia case, and so many others. Has engaging with the law been so much a part of the women's movements because it has been an easy option? That's what women have sometimes been accused of, because it lets them off working on the ground for broader change. This is an accusation, as I said, that has often been leveled. But the truth is that while the law may not be the only thing that brings change, change is incomplete without having laws in place to support it. You may ask then, what is the use of good laws if the lawmakers are misogynist, and if those who sit in authority in courtrooms are also like that? And actually, this is why the efforts of women activists have been focused on other areas of concern. Thinking and activism on all of these feeds into the process of lawmaking. I think we all know that legal change, or rather progressive legal change, never comes of its own accord. No matter how liberal states are, they are reluctant to concede more power to their citizens. So such change has to be fought for alongside fighting for the conditions that create the need for such change. So for example, as long as the patriarchal family remains the cornerstone of our society, And within the family, the woman's role remains defined as a secondary one, where unpaid work, long hours, no age of retirement, no value for her work, no rights to her body, all of these remain a given. As long as that remains the norm, deep changes will be hard to achieve. But that doesn't mean we don't fight for change in whichever way we can. And the law is one such horizon. So if you look at, say, the last 4 or 5 decades of lawmaking and the changes that have been brought about as a result of women's activism, the list is not unimpressive. The law on rape, changes in the inheritance laws of personal laws of communities, the Prevention of Atrocities Act, the Domestic Violence Act, the POSH Act, and so much more. And yet, even though this record is impressive, it's not enough. But the courts still find it easy to announce that 25-year-old women, 24-year-old women have no right to choose how they marry. States are still able to bring in this nonsensical love jihad law to target consenting adults. Marital rape still remains acceptable, with the Chief Justice holding that it is okay for a man to coerce his wife into sexual intercourse. Or, as Justice Ranganath Mishra, once the Chief Justice and later the head of the National Human Rights Commission, said, women should know that their place is not outside in the streets, but in the home. They should not go out to work. For this change to happen, for the deep change to happen, I think we need feminist thought and consciousness to develop deep roots among students of laws. We need women studies students to be much more aware of both the possibilities and the limitations of law. We need the law itself to be sensitive to endemic inequalities such as caste, gender, location, class, religion, and so on. We need many more judges at every level. We need many more women lawyers. We need also legal institutions like the Bar Council and others not to be slaves to power, but to be supporters of the battle of justice. So nearly 3 decades ago, 2 historians of the women's movement, and there are very few of them, these 2, called Nandita Gandhi and Nandita Shah, wrote an important book called The Issues at Stake. In it, they considered many different aspects of the women's movement. One of them was the battle to change law. I'd like to end with a quote from their book, which describes, which despite the passage of many years, still remains, I think, relatively true today. Here's what they say. They say the experiences of most women's groups are that women are not interested individually in taking up cudgels in court. They would rather just get on with life and not spend energy, resources, and emotion on court cases. Women's organizations themselves feel helpless when faced with women's lack of legal education, the state's political bias, and the indifference of the police and the courts when it comes to implementing the law. The question then remains, why do women's organizations still struggle with legal reform? Women's groups have also posed for themselves a different set of questions. Why is it that women cannot use even the most favorable laws to their advantage? Can our strategy not be to expose the biases in our laws, in the police and the judiciary? Can we not challenge social norms and the dominant patriarchal structures and ideologies that provide some relief to women? We need to consider these questions. We can no longer afford to be neutral. This is the close. This is where Nandita and Nandita's quotation closes. And a small story which helps us to think in a somewhat different direction is a story of a woman called Sharifa Khanum, who comes from Tamil Nadu and who was, like many women, just an ordinary woman without much feminist consciousness until 1991, when she, no, was it not 1991? 1988, I'm sorry, 1988, when she came to a women's conference in Patna to act as a translator, translating what was being discussed over there from Hindi to Tamil for her Tamil sisters. And she heard women for the first time speaking about intimate issues of domestic violence and such like, and realized that, my God, these issues can be talked about, that women can come together and discuss what happens to them, and these issues, she was not the only one facing them. She went back to Tamil Nadu and started an organization called the Women's Jamaat, which is like the Jamaat, which is made up of elders of the community who decide on all matters that do not need to go to the court. And the Women's Jamaat today has 25,000 plus members and helps to solve so many cases. So here is an alternative gendered kind of legal structure, which gives us some options of thinking a bit differently. So I'm going to stop here. Thank you so much for listening to me. I hope I've not bored you stiff. And I'm happy for us to get into a discussion now.
Thank you, ma'am, for a very inspiring lecture. And we are very happy to hear your experiences which you have shared with us. We now begin with the question answer session. I request the students and the audience to kindly switch on your mic and ask questions to Ma'am Urvashi. Or you can also raise your hands, please.
Doesn't matter if you don't have questions. That's also okay.
Arshi, do you want to ask a question? Arshi,
Yes,
go
ma'am.
ahead, please.
Thank you so
Yes,
much,
thank
Urvashi,
you.
ma'am. Ma'am, my question is not so much a question. I just wanted to understand better as you were giving us more knowledge and understanding of the last few decades. Ma'am, in regard with the fact that, lawmakers right now, after 70 years of independence, we women still have less than 10% average representation in the parliament. So unless we are there at the top of the structure, obviously, if you're not there, if you're not involved in the process, women are like slaves, they're not making the laws that are governing them. So I am aware that a lot was done in regard with the reservation bill being passed when it was passed eventually for the panchayats, but never for the Lok Sabha. So ma'am, if you could throw more light on, what happened, how come, why did it not go through, what can be done? Because this is something that men are never going to change on their own. They've got that power, they've got that kursi, they're not just going to give it up. So what is the solution? Because unless we resolve that, everything else we are working on is a symptom. Like even what you say that, we might fight for something today and, 20 years later, it would actually have been totally useless to fight for that because it will actually become a weakness again. So all of these are in a way, going to continue to fester unless we solve the problem at the top. So what can be done, what has already been done, and what can be done further, ma'am? Thank you.
Actually, just to correct your understanding of what I said a little bit, I didn't say that 20 years later you might find it's completely useless, because it's never been useless. It served a purpose at the time, but 20 years later, one has to basically look at how law might evolve in response to what's happening in society. And if more and more women feel they want to speak out and have their names heard, they should have that choice. So just that. But on the question of reservations, thank you for raising it. There's many things. I think one is you quite rightly pointed to the Panchayati Amendment, 73rd and 74th Amendments, which led to the reservation at the village and municipal levels. And at that time, when it was brought in, there was not much opposition to it because nobody actually thought that it's an important development that rural women or semi-urban women not in high power, will do anything, and they all thought we'll just get them to act as proxies. So there wasn't much worry or concern about it, but every study of the presence of women through reservations and now also in more general categories in panchayats and municipalities shows that they have brought about some really important change, despite the fact that people often say many of them are proxies. They may well be, but now out of the 3 million such posts in India, 1.4 are occupied by women. So almost half are occupied by women. And in many places, the percentage is much higher than the 33%. So one thing is that I think this is my interpretation, the success of the Panchayati Raj amendments is something that frightened a lot of people in the Lok Sabha. That they thought that actually if women step in, we are going to be shown up for the charlatans and the useless people we are. So they opposed it on that count. I have to say that there were differences among women's movements and women's groups themselves on whether reservation was the way forward and whether there should be reservation within reservation of excluded and marginalized categories, etc. But as you know, there was fair amount of solidarity across the board among women in politics, regardless of the parties. They did argue for reservation. But each time the bill came, it kind of just lapsed, and no political party was willing to put their weight around it, even though all of them in some ways said, yes, we'll fight for it, etc. There are many discussions on this and many points of view. I believe that it's inevitable. It'll happen. It will have to be raised again. It can be allowed to lapse again, but eventually it will happen. But I also believe that while it's really important, it's not enough, because you have to have not only women in numbers representing the population at the top level in governance, but you also have to have all along the board political parties being willing to put up women, and then those women being involved in every possible system of planning so that you can get at least their inputs into it. And what's more, those women being also trained to be sensitive and open to women, because just the fact of there being women will not necessarily result in that, although I think numbers are really, really important. So they have to be there. I mean, if you look at Kerala and how women have been involved from the ground up, it gives you a model of the possibility of involving women. Then I think there is also, there is a lack of, how should I say, creative thinking maybe. I mean, it is true that the size of the Indian parliament has increased from 300 something to 590 something over the last 70 years, which is a little bit crazy. It needs to be a much bigger house. So there is a kind of thinking that says that, okay, the men who are scared that they will have to give up power to make space for women, perhaps you can just increase the size of the house and bring in women. So there are a lot of discussions and issues around this, and none of them has as yet been resolved. But I think there are fairly strong debates on it, and let's hope that the bill gets introduced again. Let's hope that parties put their might behind it.
Ma'am, other than the bill, are there any other methods available? Like, for example, I'm just thinking out loud here. Can Election Commission of India, because they are the ones who are responsible for ensuring that there is a representative democracy in play here, can they be taken to court? Because 70 years of figures are there in front of them. They have not been able to provide basic representation. When a human being is born, the doctor says it's a boy, it's a girl, and only the boys have been allowed to have the representation. 90% of the seats over 70 years. So can ECI be held responsible and be
I don't know.
responsible?
Yeah, this is not a question that I am at all qualified to answer, because I don't know what the powers of the ECI are in this regard. So I don't know if I can answer that. It's probably you need to put this to a constitutional...
Other than the bill, yes, ma'am. Ma'am, like you said, like creativity perspective, if we think of more creative solutions, other than the bill, is there anything that comes to your mind? Like what other things can be done to bring about this change? Or it has to be the lawmakers who have to, because they're never going to let...
No.
Yes, ma'am.
Sorry, no, I don't think it has to be the lawmakers. I think the law has to come in, but I don't think it has to be the lawmakers. And say, for example, one of the things that we are noticing or seeing now is the increasing numbers of women who are voting in national elections and who are not voting now alongside their communities, but are voting on issues which are important to them. I think that will also produce a kind of investment in politics where with possibly women can start making these demands on the ground, because nothing will change I mean, the change will not come from above. There has to be a push for change. There has to be protest for change. I mean, I don't think any progressive change will come from above. Yes, the government will take away the powers of the Delhi government. That they'll do. You know, Parliament will take away the powers of the Delhi government, and that's a change that come from above. But really progressive change, I don't think will come from there. So there'll have to be a push. There'll have to be a recognition of women and the contribution they can make. And women's groups are just small fry to do this, but they are trying to do it. They're the only people who are trying to do it, really. So I don't have a solution for you, but I think we need to understand the resistance and where it's coming from, and that may help us to think of creative ways to address that.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thanks, Arshi. I request the students over here to please ask a question.
Good evening, ma'am.
Yeah, thanks,
Yeah.
Amrita.
Yeah, ma'am, recently we have seen some regressive judgment coming from Nagpur court by Lady Just Pushpa, where she has said that skin to skin touch is not coming under POSCO sexual assault. So what you have to say about a judgment which is coming, which is against women and children coming from Lady Judge?
You know, Amrita, I think we have to recognize it just occupying or being of that gender. So we're talking about the absence, we're talking about the importance of more and more women in the lawmaking processes as judges and so on and so forth. But we have to always be aware that actually just the numbers will not necessarily make a difference. And just putting women in positions of power will not mean that they will be sensitive to other women or sensitive to the issues around them. And actually, I don't think we should expect them to be. See, ask yourself if you have ever asked this question of a male judge who has made any number of regressive statements about men. We don't. No, because we take it that judges do this. But when a woman does that about another woman, or about the Nagpur case is about a child, when a woman does that, we feel, ye kya kar rahi hai? She should, she's a woman, she should be looking positively at women. No, because women are also people with faults, with prejudices. They are products of patriarchy, etc. And we are lucky if we get a woman in power who is sensitive and who will make good judgments. So I would suggest you look, for example, at the work of this judge from Tamil Nadu called, she's called Pratibha. I don't know, I forget her second name. She's the one who gave some really interesting judgments in the case of the valuation of women's work within the home in relation to some motor insurance cases. But so, you get that kind of judgment and you get this Judge Pushpa's kind of judgment. And that's because women have all the warts and faults that all human beings do.
Yeah, thank you, ma'am.
Do we have some more questions over here? The law college students, could you please ask? Okay, ma'am, I had a question. As you told us about the active involvement during your times of the college students in all the movements, do you find that there has been a change with regard to how students would involve in such movements? If there is a change, I would want to know about it. And also, why is this change seen over a period of time?
I think there is a change, and I think there are many reasons why such change happens. But I don't also think that the change is so radical or so uniform, because it's not to do with students themselves as much as it is to do with many other things. For example, the modes of protest, Shala, are changing and have changed from the time that people of my generation became involved. So, for example, in cities and other places, you don't see that much street level protest as you used to earlier. And now, of course, you don't see any at all, because the courts and the government have ruled against protests and see them as illegitimate, although they're an expression of our democratic rights. So now, because people have become so vulnerable, sorry, there's a lot of noise. Are you also hearing it, or is it just me?
Styla ma'am, please turn off your mic. I think it's coming from there.
Yeah, amazing. Okay, so I think partly the modes of protest have changed. I think partly the nature of the state has changed, in the sense that the state has become much more remote, much less bothered about its citizens, and much more focused on elections, and really seeing in cases even being more or less at war with its citizens. So for students and others, even if they wanted to protest, where do they go? What do they do? And the presence of the internet and the building of communities across the internet has turned the internet into a kind of arena of protest, which is both powerful and powerless. Powerful because everybody is putting out things on Twitter, and powerless because actually unless you can build up numbers, the state doesn't really give a damn about you, and it's difficult to give an expression of those numbers on the net, because they don't, I don't know what kind of pressure they can build up. But I do find, interestingly, that students, young people in their 20s, late 20s today, especially in, say, places like your university or Ashoka and other places where I teach, they have a genuine curiosity and a genuine interest, and are very political in the ways they think, and are also, when given the chance, really ready to go out and do things often at considerable risk to themselves. I mean, you saw, I'm sure, across the country, even the anti-CAA protests. Most of those protests were held together through the voluntary work of so many young people from universities and colleges. And even today in Delhi, where the farmers are sitting in protest, who are the people who are going every day to help them out, to teach their kids? All of that is the students. So I think it's also that circumstances around them have changed, and those forms of expression of political difference and anti-discriminatory views, etc., not so open to them as they were to us.
Ma'am, regarding this, recently we have seen like a lot of protests by women in social media regarding that rape James comment. So do you think, like what you said, it's powerless also, and you see a lot of protest people coming out also, in more number of people are expressing their protest. So what do you say, like, if these things will make any difference to the government, to the people who are saying these words?
To some extent, Amrita, everything makes a difference if it comes to their notice. And they are noticing. I'll give you, that chap, what's his name, the chief minister who made those dreadful comments, is already trying to retract in one way or the other without losing face too much. It may not make any difference to the way he thinks, but publicly, at least, he's being forced to retract. Similarly, when the Chief Justice made those comments in the judgment he was giving, or when he was the trial of the case in which he asked the rapist if he would marry the girl he had raped over many years, there was a letter that women's groups put out, and that letter was circulated on the net, and it gathered initially 4,000 signatures and then 7,000, and a few newspapers carried it. And it had enough of an impact for him to come and explain himself and try to retract his statement, and later to give this statement saying judges should not comment on women's personal lives and so on and so forth. So now you may say, that is just superficial on the face of it. But actually, it does have some little impact at least. And therefore, I think it's important to fight for those. I mentioned when I was presenting my paper, the micro steps. I think these are all important. They add up. And it's not only important for the result it has, but it is also important for the solidarity it builds among us when we get together to do something like that.
Yes, ma'am.
I'd like to ask a question about the recent laws that have come which prohibit it's like prohibiting interreligious marriages, the whole concept of love jihad. Could you comment on this?
Well, I think, we all know those laws are really shitty, actually, and they should not have been allowed to happen, and they're completely anti-constitutional. But, the ways in which our politics and our judiciary are now so compromised, I don't know if we can expect that they will ever change. And the tragedy is that the prejudice on which those laws structure themselves is so deep-rooted in our society that there is wide acceptability for it. And the ways in which they infantilize women is something that nobody's talking about. Because that's also what often families want. So the woman can keep saying that this is a consenting relationship, but the law and the self-appointed guardians of morality have decided that it is, she doesn't know what she wants, and they will therefore exercise even violence to stop that. One of the things I wanted to mention in my talk, but I didn't do so because of time. There is a very, very interesting case which those of you who are students of law might like to look at, which happens in the post-partition years. And it's called Ajaib Singh versus the state of Punjab. And it's a case of an abducted woman, a young woman of 13 or 14, who is found in the house of a Sardar somewhere in Faridkot district, and who is assumed to have been an abducted Muslim woman, even though he claims she is his daughter. And so the police go into his house and take that child away. And according to the law, they will send her, they call it convey her to Pakistan. And he files a habeas corpus petition saying that she should not be sent away until the case is, I guess, argued on constitutional issues, okay, which is very, very interesting. And one of the issues they're arguing about is that in order to go into a house and pick up a woman you assume has been abducted, you have to have a law under which you can act. And there is no law other than the criminal law under which you arrest somebody. So they go and actually arrest these women, but these women have committed no crime. Then they hold them in detention. But even when you arrest a person and you hold the person in detention, you're obliged to tell that person what they've been accused of. But these women are not accused of anything, so they can't tell them that. And so they're holding them indefinitely until some decision is taken, etc., etc. And the judges debate whether this arrest is unconstitutional or whether this law that allows you to arrest is ultra vires of the constitution, etc. And eventually they come to the conclusion that it is not. And why is it not? Because actually this poor woman doesn't know what she wants, and she's an abducted woman, and the state and the forces of the state know much better how to place her, and I'm, paraphrasing their words, how to place her in a situation which is free from fear, where she can decide for herself. And therefore, the detention under which she's held is a kind of protective detention for her own good. They call it that we are holding her in protection. We are the state. We are like her parent. We are holding her in detention. This infantilizing of women is what you see even today in the law, all the time. You see it in the Hadia case, you see it in the triple talaq cases. I mean, there are just so many instances of it.
Thanks, Nishta. Do we have some more questions? I request the law college students to please ask. Okay, so thank you, Ma'am Urvashi, for such a insightful lecture you have delivered. I now request Ms. Amrita to kindly propose the vote of thanks.
Good evening, everyone. I would like to thank Speaker for the Day, Urvashi Batalia Ma'am, participants, Goa University Administration for administrative support and for making this lecture series possible. I would also like to thank students, faculty, and staff of Women's Studies, Manohar Parrikar School of Law, Governance and Public Policy, and V.M. Salgaonkar College of Law, which have worked together to make this event a success. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Amrita. Thank you, Shella, and everybody. Thanks for listening, and good luck with everything. Okay. Bye.
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 Thank you very much, Urvashi, for taking time out and being with us.